Welcome to our YouTube channel Klimawissen Online. Today we have an English lecture and our speaker is Professor Petra Tschakert. Some words about her. Petra is from Austria. She grew up in Graz, so we could also speak in German with her, but this is an English-speaking lecture or session today, so we try to do all of it in English. And Petra Tschakert studied geography in Graz and did her PhD at the University of Arizona in the US. And after many years and activities in the US, she went to Australia, where she works at the University of Western Australia in Perth. And her research areas include the interactions between humans and the environment, the livelihood of the rural population, the development of rural areas, and much more. And among other things, climate justice and justice in climate change adaptation. And she's one of the authors of the 5th status report of the IPCC, and also one of the authors of the special report on the global warming of 1.5 degrees of the IPCC. By the way, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the title of her today's lecture is Justice in Climate Change Adaptation. And more about it we will hear from her. And so as I now welcome Petra, thank you that you can join us today. And the stage is yours for the next half hour. Hello, Petra. Jetzt hören wir dich gerade noch nicht, Petra. Moment einmal.
You should hear me now.
Yes.
Hello, good morning, everybody. I am absolutely delighted, very, very happy to be speaking to you today from Australia. I looked it up. There are over 13,000 kilometers between Graz, Styria, and where I sit in Western Australia. So I am delighted to be here with you. Let me just set my clock here so I don't get too distracted. So the topic of today is justice in climate change adaptation. And many of you, I imagine, will be familiar with the motto, the battle cry of the climate justice movement. What do we want? Climate justice. When do we want it? Now. And so this is what I will be talking about, but you will hear one very specific focus element. I imagine that some of you may have been part of climate marches. Some of you may have been part of climate protests in Graz, maybe in Vienna. Maybe some of you are part of religious groups or faith-based groups that also have a climate justice focus. And this is all very, very important work. Now, before I go into the topic, I want to introduce myself in a little more depth. Michael has already started. Indeed, I grew up in Graz. So I did my high school years at the Gymnasium Dreihackengasse in Graz, and then left Austria to enjoy many different adventures. And one of them was being part of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is the scientific authority on everything we know about climate change. And you can see that at a certain point I had red hair and now a little bit more gray, but you can see me here in the middle still with red hair on the special report on 1.5 degree warming, which came out in 2018. I also have done quite a lot of work in a development context. You can see me here with a woman in Nepal, in Asia. I was lucky to receive the reward or an award called the Pierre Sellers Award for world-leading solution-focused climate research, which was just wonderful. And I am now working on an initiative, a national strategy in Australia called the National Strategy for Just Adaptation. And this is what I want to be talking about with you. Now, let me show a little bit of background context that we may want to need later. So I'm trying to advance my slides. Let me try this again. Here. If you want to read more about climate justice, I highly recommend this short report. It's called In-Depth Questions and Answer, What is Climate Justice? From the Carbon Brief. I have provided the email, not the email, the web link, so you can find it easily. It talks about things that I will not cover today. Predominantly fair shares of emissions. What emissions are fair? Is it fair that the rich countries have been allowed so many more emissions over time than poor countries? And what is a fair limit to emissions? Climate debt and climate finance. Is it correct, and I think it is, that the rich countries own a climate debt to poorer countries, but the rich countries don't want to pay? Climate justice also includes questions around just solutions. We don't want false solutions that are reliant heavily on technology, which is expensive, maybe dangerous, not proven yet. We don't want geoengineering of our planet. What we do want are just transitions to a world that does not rely on fossil fuels anymore, that ensures that workers who currently work in the fossil fuel industry have alternatives, best in renewable energies. So these are all big questions, and they're very, very important. And I hope some of you are interested in these and maybe want to pursue them in your lives and careers after high school. What I do want to talk about is a little different. It's still climate justice, but it looks at unjust dynamics. And by unjust dynamics, I mean different types of exposure and different types of vulnerability. Vulnerability is an important word in what I'm going to say, and my English is a little rusty, so I had to look up what it actually means in German. It is Verwundbarkeit. You know, when we experience harm, that's what vulnerability is. And you can see the picture to the right, which is a picture from São Paulo in Brazil. And you see two very different neighborhoods next to each other. A poor neighborhood, a favela, a slum, and a super rich neighborhood or compound right on the other side of a brick wall. Both will be exposed to the same climate hazard, a flood or a heat wave, but they're not vulnerable in the same way. If you're lucky and you live on this side to the right, if it's really, really hot, well, you go to the swimming pool, or maybe you enjoy your little swimming pool on your super big mega patio or terrace, or you have air conditioning inside. If you live on this side of the brick wall, you have no swimming pool, nor air conditioning, no breeze. You're stuck in a tin hut or a tin roof, and you also don't have insurance against anything. So the vulnerabilities, the ability to be harmed, are very different. Okay, so that's the first point I want to make. We also then need to account for what we call the triple injustices in climate change. There are many, but three are really, really important. And they're quite simple, actually. Those who have produced the least emissions, the peoples in the favelas, the people in poor countries, experience the most harm. Surely, that's not fair. That's not just. They disproportionately face these local or regional impacts. They are suffering much more than anybody else. And they have the fewest resources to adapt. They have the fewest resources to protect themselves, and that's why they suffer more. They don't have air conditioning, they don't have insurance, they have nowhere else to go. Right? So these are the triple injustices. And we can relate them, and this is what we do in science, in academia, to three basic types of justice. Distributive, it's about the distribution of benefits and burdens, and they're uneven. It's about procedural justice, processes of decision-making, who can be part of decision-making and who is excluded. And ultimately, it's about recognition or recognitional justice. Who is recognized when decisions are made? Well, the poor favela inhabitants, those who live there, are often not even recognized as real citizens. They're not recognized for having rights, and therefore they're not invited to decision-making fora. And that's what we talk about when we mean climate injustices. Okay? Now, let me show you another example from Brazil. And this is not my work, but this was the work of my doctorate student or PhD student, Karen Paiva Henrique. She is from Brazil, and she studied just or unjust climate adaptation in São Paulo. And she studied the role of the government, the role of the state in proposing adaptation solutions. And I will come and define adaptation later in a moment. But adaptation really means to adapt, to adjust, to protect ourselves. So São Paulo is not on the coast, but close. It has a big river called the Tietê River. And the government has proposed to make a park along the Tietê River, as you can see here. This is a drawing, to protect people from floods, because this river floods every year. And this looks quite beautiful, right? So I wouldn't mind living there. The problem is that this wonderful, nice park is made for the richer people in São Paulo. The poorer people, the informal residents, the informal settlers, the slum dwellers, they also live right next to the river. But in order to make this beautiful park, these people from these poor neighborhoods are displaced. They're removed. They're removed to other parts of the city where they really don't belong, they don't have history there, and they have to create their lives all over again. So here's an injustice when we talk about climate adaptation planning. There are many plans out there, and on the surface, they may look beautiful. But when we look closer, we see the injustices involved. And again, those who have caused the least emissions face the most burden, the most harm. And that's a problem. Okay? So let me explain how this all comes together. And this is a graphic from the IPCC that I have created. I'm very proud of it. And it shows that vulnerability, Verwundbarkeit, can have many different dimensions. And to understand these dimensions, we have to look at intersecting inequalities. Intersecting meaning those that cross over, and inequalities are, of course, Ungleichheiten. And it goes as follows. Dimensions of inequality, you can see them in the bottom left: gender, class, race, ethnicity, indigeneity, disability. They all come together. And together, when they come together, they make some privileged people, but many more marginalized people, people who live at the margin of society, who are not allowed to participate. And these marginalized people are often at risk from climate change, hazards, floods, heat waves, droughts, but they're also at risk from climate change responses, like the adaptation plan for São Paulo I just showed you. They have many vulnerabilities, and their capacities and opportunities to do something is very, very low. On the other side, you have some few privileged people, the richest, the most successful, the most powerful, the elites, who have very low vulnerability. They still do, but it's much lower, and many more capacities and opportunities to act. So how do we navigate this? How do we deal with these inequalities that we encounter in every society, not just in Brazil, also in Australia, in Austria, everywhere? So vulnerability and resilience, two words that are really important when it comes to justice. And I have a couple of images here. When you go into Google and you type in resilience, Widerstandsfähigkeit, you see images like this tree bending or possibly breaking. You see images like this little plant coming out of a dry soil. And you see many men who are strong, who can withstand harm, and who can protect themselves. And when you look at vulnerability or vulnerable, unfortunately, you will see many images of women and girls. And I find this very, very, very problematic. We're all vulnerable and we're all resilient to some extent. To say or to think that women are more vulnerable and men or boys are more resilient is just not correct. But society makes us believe this. So don't believe this. Don't fall into this trap. Because really, vulnerability is something that we share. All of us are vulnerable. And you can see here people who are part of a project in Canada, holding up the letters of vulnerable, and some of them have the letter painted on their skin, on their chest, on their arms. And if we want to talk about just adaptation, we also have to recognize that we are vulnerable. We, all of us, even me. I'm a university professor. I have a very nice salary. But I'm vulnerable to a heat stroke. And this is true for everybody. So we have to recognize it, we have to accept it, and we have to embrace it. We have to carry it. It's part of who we are. So now let's get to adaptation. The IPCC defines adaptation, as you see it here, as a process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. Right? We're making adjustments. We're doing things a little bit differently. And often it's incremental, step by step. And only sometimes it is what we call transformational. But we may need more transformation than we think. So let me give you an example of adjustment. I don't know how many of you are watching the Winter Olympics. I am in Beijing. So those of you who watch, you have probably seen that a lot of the snow that is used is artificial. Okay. Climate change does not produce reliable winter seasons anymore. So instead of real snow, we just use artificial snow coming out of snow cannons. That's incremental adaptation. A little bit of an adjustment. Transformational adaptation would be something more radical, something more dramatic. For example, if we give up winter sports altogether outside, no more skiing, no more, how do we call it, Langlaufen, and if we just say, okay, no more snow, let's just do hiking. And this would change the entire tourism sector in the winter, okay? So adaptation. most of the time, we do not get to transformational or transformative adaptation. This graphic and everything it entails, everything that you see is what we should do. We should be prepared for the many climate change hazards and impacts, extreme storms, droughts, winds, ocean acidification. I'm sure you have learned about this. So we should be able to address all these. But we also should be able to address these drivers of vulnerability, the causes of vulnerability that make so many people, millions, billions, much more vulnerable than others. And we don't do a good job. Then we should think about how do systems change altogether? When does a system shift from sustainable to unsustainable? When does a lake shift from healthy to unhealthy? And we don't do a good job on that front either. We do even less of a good job when it comes to making empowered decisions, deliberating, discussing, negotiating. There are no simple solutions. So we have to engage in dialogue and discussion and deliberation. And most difficult of all of this is to think about dimensions of justice, of equity, of inclusion. What is fair and for whom and why? And this is not something we want to leave to policymakers. We as citizens have to participate. So if we go for this type of adaptation, transformative, or it's also known as transformational adaptation, it's the best. It's most inclusive. It allows people to show their agency, show their capacity, be recognized as citizens who have rights, and try to achieve just and fair outcomes. Governments don't like it because it requires a lot of work with people and their needs and their wishes and their aspirations for what is just. And many governments, like the one we have seen in São Paulo in Brazil, they like to hold on to their power, to their status. So in order to do this, we have to do better than what we currently do. Currently, today, most governments do sectoral adaptation. Adaptation for one or more sectors in the economy. Like here, this is an example from St. Lucia. This is a Caribbean island. And so this is the plan for St. Lucia. Adaptation, measurements, adjustments for the water sector, agriculture, fisheries, infrastructure, natural resource management, education, health, tourism, right? One sector after the other, and then maybe these plans are put together. As I said, governments like it. It's easy to plan, it's easy to spend money on, and it's easy to monitor. The problem is, if we look at sectoral adaptation, people are nowhere. They don't talk about people. They're blind, these plans, to uneven power dynamics. And very often, they reinforce vulnerabilities rather than reducing them. Let's take a look at what's happening in Austria. So here is the sectoral adaptation strategy for Austria. And again, just like in it goes sector by sector by sector. People are in there, but not a whole lot. We can do better than that. How do we do this? And I'll show you what I have done. So I have focused on people in my research, in my work on adaptation. I focus on people and what people want based on what they value most in life and what they want to protect. And this is how I think about it. There are some risks to all of us, to how we live, what we do, how we go to work, if we want to create a family or not. There's some risks, but some of these risks are acceptable. Some risks are tolerable. We may not like them, but we are still tolerating them. We say, okay, I'm willing to tolerate. And some risks are not okay. They're intolerable. And beyond this red line, which we call the adaptation limit, these risks become intolerable. And we need to understand which risks are acceptable for whom and why, and which are not. And if we do that, then we need a different definition of adaptation. So not just adjustments, but then we want to see adaptation as attempts, efforts to keep risks to valued objects or objectives at a tolerable level. We protect what we care about most. And limits to adaptation are the points at which our adaptation fails to protect the things that we value. It's a very different approach to adaptation. I like it a lot. It's most meaningful. It's important to people. They can own it. They can agree. They can say, this is what I want to protect, and here's why, and I will do everything I can to do this. Government or agencies don't like it so much because it's difficult to compare one situation, one community to another. People have many values. So how do we do this? And I'll show you how we have done this. So we work with people in communities in Western Australia, and we have a whole list of things that they may value. And we ask them what things they value most. So if you look at this board, most is on this right-hand side of the axis, less is over there. And to which extent the things that they value are already impacted, affected by climate change. Highly up here and not so much down here. And we ask people about the distribution of what they value in the present, current conditions, white magnets. And then we ask them to imagine the future, 20, 25 years from now. And many of the magnets then move on the board to the upper right, and you can see many here. Meaning even more valued, even more precious, even more important, but also more affected, more damage, more destruction. So let me show you what these are. So the things that people want to value a lot and want to hold on to, they don't want to give them up, are my family, of course, feeling safe in this place where people live, having my own home, plants and animals around me, maintaining my own identity, a sense of community, and the therapeutic value of a place or a land. Now with COVID in particular, there are things people would let go of. You know, if I lose that, I don't mind. Maybe recreation centers, sports, maybe not that important after all. Culture and entertainment. Yes, we like going to theaters, bars. But if we have to give up something, that's probably an easy thing to give up. And then there are things that people would identify as intolerable losses, terrible losses, if they didn't have these anymore. And you can see these in the black stars here. This is how we try to understand how to design adaptation plans based on what people value most, want to hold on to, and would find as intolerable if they lost those things. And that's a very different approach compared to top-down adaptation thinking. I show these two examples here because these are the two that we found become most important. Plants and animals around me, if you think about the board again that I showed you, all people think that plants and animals in the future will become more important to them, but also more impacted. And many think that plants and animals here in Western Australia, where it is so hot, we have had 13 days over 40 degrees Celsius already this summer, new record. And many plants and animals, they think, will not survive that. They're not salvageable. But people also value their mental and emotional health, trying to stay sane and healthy, knowing how difficult it is to protect what they value. Now, I'll turn to you. Climate justice, if we want to define it now for us a little differently, means generating the necessary conditions so that historically marginalized groups are able to shape their future in their own terms. And historically marginalized groups includes the youth, you. Why? Because you are not allowed to vote yet for a government that cares about you. So, climate justice for your future. What is it that you consider a top value for the future? What is it that you want to hold on to? Identify those, write those down, think about them. And which losses would you think are intolerable, absolutely unacceptable? And then take these to your parents, to your teachers, to your governmental representatives, because this is your future. This is how we think about just adaptation and justice in climate. If the things that we value most cannot be protected, we encounter losses and damages. This is a complicated graphic, and I don't want to go too much into detail, but you can see again many things that people value here to the left. You can see different types of climate stressors. And the darker the colors, brown for damage, red for loss, and yellow, orange for at risk is, the darker these colors, the more evidence, the more proof we have of these being already damaged or already lost in different parts of the world. And here's an example of identity. You know, we think, why does identity matter for climate change? It matters, as an example, for men in Australia who are farmers. During the 10-year drought, the millennium drought, many men, like this one here, thought, if I fail as a farmer, I fail as a man. It would undermine, erode, kill their identity, because their identity was to be proud farmers, strong farmers, successful farmers, but they didn't manage. Many people did not. It was a 10-year drought. And many men, farmers, committed suicide because their identity was lost. So these things matter. Now, how do we think about the future? I want to show you three examples from my work here. We envision the future with participatory drawings. We call them scenario building scenarios for the future, to think about our places in 20, 30 years' time. When you have children your age, possibly, how would the future look like? What do you want to have in there? These are examples from Ghana, West Africa, Tanzania, in East Africa. And people draw these. Some people don't read and write, older people in particular. But drawings, everybody understands. We've also done something similar, drawings and then planning with satellite images and layers of opportunities and barriers, so people can develop their plans at the community level, like neighborhoods in Sao Paulo, like neighborhoods in Graz or anywhere in Styria, Bezirke, and come up with their own plans that they can carry to the local governments. And we have done something similar. It looks a little different here with older people in Western Australia where I work. It's called backcasting. We start with the future people want in 2040. And then we say, what do we need to do to get to the best possible future from where we are now in 2021? What are the pathways, the roads to get there? Which roads go straight up? And which roads kind of go up and then go down towards the worst because there are too many obstacles, negative pivot points, too many barriers. And what roads like this one go down and don't even continue after 2030? If we have social breakdown and climate breakdown, one participant said, it's kaboom. The bomb goes off and we probably end up in anarchy. So this is a way to think about just adaptation planning with people being actively involved. Now, I want to end, and I want to bring in one last aspect, one last dimension. I have talked a lot about people, poor people, rich people, young people, old people. But what about other beings? What about other species than humans? This is called multi-species justice. And the picture you see here is a picture of the smooth hand fish. How many of you have ever seen this fish? Probably nobody. I did not know about it. It's a fish that lived in a particular area next to Tasmania in Australia. And it turns out that in 2020, it was found extinct, lost forever. And you look at this fish and you think, wow, what a crazy creature, you know, like a punk. And you think, why do I care about this fish? What does this fish matter to me? But when people here in Australia understood that this fish would not come back, something changed in their minds. And this is what multi-species justice is about. So maybe what we should do, whether it's with this fish or with the bees or the trees that we need to cool down our cities, we need to think about others, not just us, our family, our pets. We need to think about other creatures. And we need to overcome what we call human exceptionalism, that it's just about us, and that we people are the most evolved beings on the planet, and the most important ones. These creatures matter too. So what we have to think about in multi-species justice is how we are dependent on each other, how we need each other every day. And that opens a wholly different dimension. And maybe this graphic comes in handy. I've thought about it a lot. So it's very easy down here to care about ourselves, to protect us, our family, our friends, our neighbors. And it's fairly easy to protect our pets and animals and plants that are similar or familiar to us. These are known others. It's much more difficult to protect, to care about, to speak up for distant others that we see, but they're far away, like polar bears, koalas that have burned in the wildfires here in Australia, or the climate migrants that you guys see coming from Africa over the Mediterranean into Europe. Those people that we consider less than humans, the homeless people on the streets. And it's even more difficult to care about unknown others, those that we don't even see, that we think we never need, like invasive species, reptiles like snakes, future generations. So how do we do inclusive adaptation, where we have empathy, where we care about those that are far away and develop responsibility for all of them? If we can do that, it's not only inclusive, but it's also just. So, almost finished. Just and desirable adaptation pathways. This is the pathway that we have taken to the present. This is what the government has done for us. This is what we have done for ourselves. This is what our community has done. We can continue business as usual, and it will not get us to a just and safe space. We have to do things differently. We have to transform. We have to transform how we live, how we're responsible for others, and how we can work together by deliberating trade-offs. How to make decisions, what is fair and to whom and why, and negotiate resilience. And in order to do that, we have to be able to see that vulnerability, Verwundbarkeit, is not a weakness. Many people think if you say that you are vulnerable, you're weak. No, vulnerability is courage, where courage meets fear. And if we can recognize that, not just in ourselves, but in others, we have a much better chance to achieve just adaptation. And if you're interested to learn more about this, I know this session is recorded. You can see the web link here. Listen to Brené Brown talk about vulnerability as courage. It is super important. So here we are. Adaptation justice. How do we work together? How do we care for each other? Those who are here today, those we know well, and those we have not met yet. Thank you very much for listening.